Hey there, how's it going? This is Moby from Moby Motion, and today I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about LuxRender. Now this will cover everything from downloading it, installing it, which I know can be quite tricky. Then we'll talk about setting up a scene in LuxRender. Right at the end, I'll cover some tips on improving your render speed, especially if you have a GPU. So let's get started. We're going to open up the internet and go to LuxRender.net. Then we'll go to download and select the appropriate version for your system. So I'm going to download this Windows version, and again you want to choose the appropriate version here. So OpenCL if you do have a graphics card, no OpenCL if you don't have a graphics card, and choose the appropriate version, whether you have 64-bit or 32-bit. So I'm going to download a 64-bit OpenCL version. Once that's ready, you want to run through the installer. And here, make sure you install the exporter for Blender. This will help you integrate the two. Now, I don't want to launch LuxRender because I want to integrate it into Blender, so I'll just hit Finish. Now, if we open Blender, we don't see it in the Renderer menu. And that's because we have to install it still as a plugin. Now, we'll do that by going to File, User Preferences, Add-ons, and Install from File. Now, you want to navigate to where it installed. It's going to be in Program Files, LuxRender, and you want to select luxblend.zip and install from File. This will take a while, but then you see this new tab here which says Render, LuxRender. You want to tick it. Again, that might take a while to load. So once you've ticked that box, save user settings, and now you'll see LuxRender in the menu. Now let's hit F12 to see what we get. You can see an error message pops up, LuxRender not found at path, and it goes into my local directory, temp LuxRender. That's a common problem that I get when I'm first installing LuxRender for the first time on a new system, so we'll need to fix that by going into the user settings again. Now you can see in the preferences here, it says path to LuxRender installation, and we want to point this so that Blender knows where LuxRender is exactly. I'm going to go to the same folder we were in before, so Program Files /LuxRender, and click Accept. Now save your settings again and hit F12. This time you'll see another window pop up, which is LuxRender rendering your scene. So now if we hit F12, you'll see LuxRender pops up in a new window and it renders our cube. And it's not the best looking cube in the world, so let's play around with the LuxRender materials to see if we can get it to look a bit more realistic. I'm going to go to my camera view with 0 on the number pad. I'm going to grab the cube in the Z-axis 1, and the way I do that is by pressing G, Z, and 1. And you can see that it's now raised above the floor. So I'm going to add a plane with Shift A, add mesh plane, and I'll scale this up 16 times. I'll scale it up some more actually, so you can't see it within the camera view. And now the scene has a floor and a cube. And if we render this now, you'll see a very similar scene. Still looks boring, but now at least it has a floor. But this lets you see a very interesting feature of LuxRender, and this is the reason I use LuxRender, which is the bounce lighting. You can see this side of the cube, which was completely black beforehand, now has some light bouncing onto it. And this light is coming from the floor, and even though we have one lamp over here, the light is bouncing around very realistically. So at the moment the lighting is very bland, there's just a single spot light. So let's play around with it. I'm going to zoom out so we can see the whole scene. I'm going to select the lamp, and I'll delete it because we don't want a spot lamp. I'm going to press Shift A to add a new lamp, and this time I'm going to use a sun. And to me, this is the characteristic LuxRender lighting. And this is what LuxRender does really well. It's their sun and sky lighting. So let's go to the lamp settings here. We want to make sure that sun and sky is ticked. This will give us a nice blue background, as well as the sun light. I'm going to position this to this side and angle it so it comes in from a similar angle to where the lamp came from. So I'm pressing R to rotate. Now if I go back to the render view by pressing F12, you can see a much more realistically lit scene. So you can see the shadow here cast by the sun, but you can also see the ambient lighting caused by the sky, because the shadow is a bit blue, the sun is a bit yellow, and that all helps to add to the realism of the scene. So let's make something a bit more interesting, and I'll give us a chance to play around with the materials. So I'm going to add a few more objects. A sphere. I'm just moving these around, but keeping them locked to the floor by pressing G and Shift Z. And Shift Z is how you make sure they don't move up or down. Rest this monkey on the floor. I'm doing this in side view, which I got by pressing 3 on the number pad. Now I have a slightly more interesting scene. I'm just going to scale up this monkey slightly. Now that's going through the floor. I'm going to go to side view again with 3. And grab it up, so G, Z. And again, I'll rest it just on this floor plane. If you want to see your floor and you're in the side view, you can press Z, and that shows you the wireframe view, which helps you see the floor. And we'll press Z again to go back to solid view. We'll have a look at our scene. I'm going to move the camera around slightly by pressing Shift and F. I can use the mouse to move the camera around, and I can use W, A, S, and D to move the camera. I'll press Q to move the camera down to get a bit of a different angle on this scene. Oh. Okay, I want to be able to see the sky in the background there. Now I'm going to rotate the plane so that we don't see a corner. So I'm doing this by pressing R and Z to make sure the rotation stays locked in the Z axis. I'm just turning it around so that the background looks nice and flat and there's no corner in the horizon. So let's just see what this looks like at the moment. So I've hit F12. If you want your scene to update more quickly, you can reduce this time here. So you hover your mouse there and scroll down, and it'll update the scene every 3 seconds instead of every 10 seconds. So you can see the nice LuxRender sky in the background, but the scene still looks very boring, so let's finally add the materials. Now, this monkey, I'm going to give it some glass material. So select the monkey by right-clicking, go to the material settings, hit new, and we're going to call this glass. Now, under material type, you want to select glass. It's that easy. So glass 2 is an alternative. That can give you some more realistic materials, but it's much harder to set up, and it involves worrying about some things like the refractive index of the air, and it takes a long time to set up for a very small difference. So we're going to go ahead and use the normal glass shader, which should look something like this preview window, but let's press F12 to preview it in our scene. You can see that the monkey looks different. It has some lovely caustics there, so that's caused by the sun going through the monkey and being bounced around and coming out onto the floor. Now LuxRender also lets you play around with the transmission color. So this adds a red tint to your monkey, which you can see already there. And the nice thing is that it also affects the color of the caustics. And that's just the name for these glossy bits where light has gone through the monkey. Now I want to make this color a bit less saturated, a bit less bright, because the monkey is very red at the moment. So I'm going to click this, and we're going to change from RGB mode to HSV mode. This stands for hue, saturation, and value. And the saturation is the number we want to play with, because that decides how rich and how vivid a color is. So we'll turn that down. You can see the preview there is less of a bright red. And we'll see how that affects our scene by pressing F12 to render. And yeah, you can see the monkey has a nice, more subtle red to it now. So let's play around with these other materials. I'm going to select this sphere and I'm going to move it to the forefront so we can see this material more clearly. I'll move this cube back a little bit. So I'm going to make it smooth to make it a nice smooth sphere. I did it here by selecting smooth under the shading type. If you don't have that toolbar, you can press T and it gives you the options. Now I'm going to create a new material again and I'll call this Glossy. And we'll cover a few different types of glossy materials that you can make in LuxRender. The first, and the most basic, is car paint, which is quite a glossy material. And again, you can change the diffuse color like this. Let's change it to something like purple. And let's see what that looks like. Now, the reason you want to change the diffuse color and not the specular color is because realistic shiny materials actually reflect white just the way it is. So you can see that the sun is still reflected white, and that's how real materials behave. But when you change the diffuse color, that gives the whole thing a purple look. Okay, so you can see we've created this shiny material. It's certainly shinier than the cube we have over there. But let's talk about a few other ways to make glossy materials. There's a material called Glossy, and this behaves very similarly. You can change it by changing the diffuse color. You can see that looks very similar. But the nice thing about this glossy material is that you can change the roughness in a very similar way that you can in cycles. So we'll turn this down to just 0.01. You can see just from this preview that it's become much glossier and less rough. So it's less of a brushed metal look now, and it's much sharper, clearer shininess. So you can see the reflections are showing much more clearly in it because the roughness value has been turned down. The last shiny material we're going to talk about is metal. And we're going to use this shiny metal preset, which looks very much like a metal. It's a very accurate name. So it creates this sort of mirror ball effect. You can see the yellow sun there in the background. You can see the lovely sky because it's so shiny. You can even see this monkey here. And again, this also lets you change the color of the material. So the best way to change the color for this material is with the reflection color here. And again, you can change the roughness by changing this U roughness value. Now I'm going to go back to Glossy because I like that material the most. I'm going to make it a bit more rough than we had it. So 0.03 looks reasonable. Okay, let's press Escape to go back to our scene. Let's select our cube now and talk about the matte material, which is the basic LuxRender material. Now, even though this material looks very boring, it's actually very quick to render in LuxRender, and it's, if you're looking for a quick render, it's the fastest way that you can render a scene in Lux. Now, it doesn't have as many settings. There aren't lots of things that you can change about it, but you can change the color, and this is a really good way to get an interesting looking scene without adding render time, because all the other objects that we created have materials that take much longer. And that's because you can see that this blue cube has already rendered quite well and it's quite noise free, but this glass material still has lots of noise, especially in the caustics here where the light's shone through. And you can see this glossy material also has lots of noise, but this blue material, this matte material, already looks good. So if you were using this for a render, it would already be done and wouldn't need more render time. Now we're going to select the last object we added, the icosphere. I'm going to call this material odd, because I'm just going to talk about the odd materials that LuxRender has that are quite useful to use. So there's this one called rough glass, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It's a glass like this monkey, but it's had some roughness added to it, so it's like a brushed glass sort of look. So if we zoom in there and give it a minute to render, you can see that it looks like a rough glass, exactly like it says. Again, you can change the hue roughness, that changes how rough the glass is, and you can also change the color. Now, I recommend changing the transmission color if you want to change the way that it looks. So this is what it looks like when we've added some yellow. Let's have a look at the velvet material. And let's make it yellow again. So this one should be pretty self-explanatory. It's a velvet-like material. You can give it a color, and then the color will sort of depend on the angle. So you can see that the parts where the light is bouncing off the cube, they're a richer yellow color. But here, right in the middle, when your camera is directly facing the object, it's a different color, and that's the way that velvet behaves. There's also this mirror material. I don't find this that useful, but if you ever need a very pure mirror-like material, this is the best way to do it. And this will reflect almost all of your light. Let's see what it looks like. So you can see there's a very clear, you see it gives you a very clear reflection in this object. There's no roughness to it at all. It reflects the light exactly as it comes in. Now, scatter can give you some really nice materials, but the only problem is, and you can see this already from the preview, that it takes a really long time to render, even more than the glass, and even more than the glossy material that we've talked about. So you can see that just for this tiny preview, it's taking ages to get rid of the noise, and that's because the light has to bounce around inside the sphere itself, sort of like a subsurface scattering material, and that will take a long time to process. So because of that, I'm not going to go too deeply into this material. Actually, I liked the rough glass material, so I'm going to stick to that. Let's render this to see what it looks like before we go deeper into LuxRender. Now, this sky that we talked about is a great way to quickly set up a LuxRender scene. Let's add some HDR lighting, some high dynamic range lighting. So let's delete the sun lamp. Now, the way you usually add this in cycles is by going to the World tab, like we have here. And you can see that gives you a World helper. So you can add Hemi, HDRI, and this is the way that LuxRender handles high dynamic range lighting. It does it with a Hemi lamp. We're going to move this lamp back to the middle. So I'm going to press Shift S to snap the cursor to center, and I'm going to press Shift S again to snap selection to cursor. Now our lamp has moved back to the middle of our scene. Now if we go to the light settings for this lamp, we're going to select an HDRI map. I'm going to select something from the HDRI Haven teaser pack. It's a very good set of HDRs from Greg Zal. You should definitely check it out. I'll put a link down below in the description. I'm going to pick blinds. Now, it doesn't have to be too high resolution, so I'm going to pick the 4K version. And let's hit F12 again now. So you can see something's happening in the background. It's not just blue this time. And you can see a much more realistically lit scene now. And this really shows off the power of LuxRender, really, because where it shines is with this bounce lighting, where you have global illumination bouncing around lots of different times, creating some cool effects. So you can see it reflecting in this cube, in this sphere, and in the monkey. So this scene looks very nice, but now that we've added more complexity to it, it's taking even longer to render. So even though it's been rendering for about a minute now, there's still lots of caustics and lots of noise in this scene that doesn't look like it's going anytime soon. So let's talk about some ways to get around that. We're about to play around with some experimental features in LuxRender, so definitely save your scene at this point in case anything goes wrong. Now we're going to go to the Render tab, and we're going to scroll down, and you can see there are different rendering types. Now when it says OpenCL in the name, that means that it uses GPU acceleration. So we're going to use path OpenCL, and let's see what happens when we hit F12. You can see that it opens up the same window that we had before. Oh, it's not working. Oh, there it is. So you can see it opens up the same scene we had before, but it's loaded much more quickly. So even though we've only been rendering for 20 seconds, there's already less noise than there was before after a minute. And this really just shows the power of GPU rendering. You can see it still has these caustics, so it still has this lovely red glow underneath the monkey, but it's just doing it all much more quickly. And with this, you can always select exactly which GPUs you use. So scroll down, and here you'll see LuxRender compute settings, and you can update the OpenCL device list, and your computer will grab a list of all the GPUs that you have. So I might choose to only render on one GPU if I'm using the other one to drive my display. And that's the case now actually, so I'm going to hit F12 again, and it'll only render using the GPU that isn't used for my monitor. And that's a really useful thing to do if you're rendering something in the background and you don't want your rendering to slow down your whole computer. And again, this is still faster, even though I'm only using one graphics card, it's still faster, much faster than the CPU rendering. So that is one way to take advantage of the GPU. My favorite way to do it actually is by using a whole different version of LuxRender. So I'm going to scroll up, and you can see here, under LuxRender API, there are two different versions of the Classic API and the LuxCore API Experimental. Now this will give you a warning, but from my testing it's quite stable and it's definitely worth it for the speed benefits. So let's talk about some of the features of this LuxCore API. Firstly, if we scroll down, you'll notice two options here. Not just the rendering device for the final render, but you can also choose the device for viewport. And that's because the experimental API lets you render in real time in the viewport in the same way that Cycles does. Before we use that rendering, I'm going to go back to, before we do that, I'm going to select path again to use the same sort of fast rendering that uses the GPU. Now you can see these options aren't grayed out anymore, so we can use OpenCL for the preview, and we're also going to use it for the final render because it's much faster. And we're going to keep it as use all GPUs because that's not a problem for now. So if I press 0 to go to the camera view, and now press Shift Z in the same way that I do with Cycles, this will take a minute, but after it's loaded up the scene into memory, you'll see that it's going to preview the render right in our viewport in the same way that Cycles does. Okay, so the export is finished. It's now rendering our scene, and you can see that it's right in the viewport in the same way that Cycles is. Now that took a long time, that's because it's the first time doing it. When I render for the second time, if I press Shift Z now, it should do it more quickly than it did before. So you can see it's already gotten to that stage and straight away it's rendering. So the first time you press Shift Z in LuxRender, just bear in mind it might take a while, but it'll be faster after that. Now, there's one main reason that I like the LuxCore Experimental API, and you'll see why that is when I press F12. You'll notice that there's no new window pops up. It's going to do the rendering right in Blender. So when you use the Experimental API, you get a workflow that's much more similar to what you would do normally in Blender. This means that you can select your output. You can do all sorts of little things that you can't do with LuxRender. For example, with the normal API, with this Classic API, you can't set relative paths, and you have to create a folder before you export into it. Whereas LuxCore works very much like Blender. You just point it somewhere, you can even type in a new folder here, new folder, and hit render now. It won't give you any problems. It'll just create this folder and render into it. It's also nice because the Classic API creates lots of files in that folder. So if I were to render this scene as an animation using the Classic API, it would create a whole different file for each frame of the animation just so that it can render it. But again, the Experimental API is very similar to Cycles or Blender Internal. You just point it at a folder, hit render, and it'll just create an image file for each frame. No need to mess around with different files. You might notice that this scene is much brighter than it was before, and that's one of the current issues with the Experimental API. It seems to make things brighter than they should be. But this can be fixed really easily by going to our Scene tab, going to Color Management, and just lowering the exposure to -1. So I would just hit F12, and we'll see what it looks like afterwards. You can see this looks exactly like it did before. So when you use the Experimental API, if you get a scene that's too bright, just bear in mind that you might need to lower this exposure, and you'll have to ignore this warning. Another nice thing about LuxRender is that it lets you save in JPEG, whereas LuxRender doesn't. And this is what I do. It saves me a lot of space on my hard drive. Let's say we wanted to render this as an animation now. We would just set the resolution we want, set the folder we want, and the file type. But after we've done that, we need to set some halt conditions. If we don't, it'll render each frame infinitely and it'll never move on to the second frame. So we need to set either a number of samples, so you can get it to start after 100 samples, or you can set it by time, so it renders each frame for 60 seconds, or you can set it by noise level. Now I like to do this in samples because that way it's consistent between frames. So now I'm going to show you a tip for how to choose the number of samples. We're going to press Shift B and select a little area of our scene, just like that. And ideally you want to pick an area of your scene that's very noisy as possible. Now when we hit F12, it's only going to render that small part of our scene. And we're going to watch this scene very carefully for the noise level. As soon as the noise level comes down to an acceptable level, we're going to look up here and see what the number of samples is. So at the moment we can still see lots of noise here. So I'm going to fast forward to when it gets to a better level. So now it's been rendering and it's rendered 4,000 samples and the noise is at a reasonable level. So you can still see some sort of graininess there, but when this is an animation and it's all played one frame after the other, these tiny bits of noise won't be noticeable. So we'll hit escape, that'll stop the rendering, and we're going to hit escape again, press Shift B to select the whole scene, and we'll set the number of samples to that number that we found, so 4,000. Now when we press render animation, it's going to render each frame up until 4,000 samples, and it's going to render the whole scene. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you found that useful. If you did, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up on this video, and if you want to see more videos like this one, then subscribe to this channel and make sure to hit the little bell icon to get notified whenever I put out a new video. If you have any questions or any suggestions for future videos, then feel free to post them down below, and support me on Patreon if you'd like the link to these Blender files and to lots of exclusive content like my simulation Blender files. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.